They thought I was finished. They thought 43 years of marriage had worn me down to a quiet old man who would sign whatever paper they put in front of him. The morning of the hearing, my wife actually leaned over to her boyfriend in the courthouse hallway and whispered something that made him laugh out loud. I heard her say, "He won't even know what hit him." She was right about one thing. He didn't know what was coming. None of them did. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I am 68 years old. I spent 41 years working as a structural engineer for a firm in Hartford, Connecticut, and until 18 months ago I believed I had a happy marriage to a woman named Margaret. I called her Maggie. We had 2 grown children. At least I thought we had to. And a house on a quiet street in West Hartford that I'd paid off in full by the time I turned 55. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand the kind of man I was before. Steady. Predictable. The kind of guy who balanced the checkbook every Sunday night and changed the smoke detector batteries every February. The kind of guy who never raised his voice. The kind of guy people underestimate. It started with the thermostat. I know how that sounds. But that's where it started. Maggie had been cold for 43 years. Always cold. The thermostat in our house was set at 74 degrees from October to April, and I never complained, even when my own forehead was sweating while I watched the news. Then one Tuesday in September, I came home from the hardware store and the house was set at 68. Cool, almost crisp, and Maggie was upstairs humming. My wife, who hadn't hummed in maybe a decade. I didn't think anything of it at the time. People change. Maybe she was finally going through that late hot flash thing women talk about. But the thermostat stayed at 68, and the humming kept happening. And then her phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter charging while she made dinner, started living face down in her purse. Small things. The kind of things a man my age is supposed to miss. I want to tell you that I figured it out right away, that I'm too smart to be fooled. But the truth is I didn't want to figure it out. I had built my entire life around this woman. Our daughter Chloe lived in Boston with her husband and our 2 grandkids. Our son Jason was 37, a software engineer in Seattle. And he had been the surprise, the late baby, born when Maggie was 42. I loved that boy more than I knew how to say. The thought that anything in our family wasn't what it seemed to be, I just didn't have room for that thought, so I pushed it down. What I couldn't push down was the kitchen. In late October, I came home early from a doctor's appointment. Routine blood work took less time than I expected. I walked in through the side door from the garage, the way I always do, and I heard a man's voice in my kitchen. Not the TV. A real voice. Low and easy, like someone who'd been in that kitchen many times before. I stopped on the back stairs, my hand on the railing. I listened. He said, "Maggie, sweetheart, just tell him. Get it over with." And she said, "I can't. Not yet. Not until everything is in my name. He's going to find out about the cabin, and that's going to ruin it." The cabin. We had a place in the Berkshires that I had bought in 1991 with money I inherited from my father. It was in my name alone, but Maggie and I had been talking for years about putting it in joint title for estate planning purposes. I had been about to do it. I had the paperwork on my desk in the den. I went back out the side door. I sat in my truck in the driveway for 45 minutes, just staring at the steering wheel. Then I drove around the block, came back, made a lot of noise opening the garage, and walked into the kitchen like nothing had happened. The man was gone. Maggie was washing 2 coffee cups. 2. She kissed me on the cheek. She asked how the appointment went. That night I lay in bed next to her and I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. I was going to do what I do best, which is engineering. I was going to gather data. I was going to map the structure of what was being built around me. And only when I understood every load-bearing piece would I decide what to do with it. The next morning I called an attorney, not the family lawyer we'd used for 30 years, because Maggie knew him. I called a man named Howard Beasley, a sharp old bird I'd met through the Rotary Club 20 years back, who handled exactly these kinds of cases. I asked him to meet me for breakfast at a diner in Manchester, 2 towns over. I told him everything I'd heard. He listened, drank his coffee, and said, "Don't move money, don't change anything, don't tip her off." I want you to live exactly the life you've been living until I tell you otherwise. I asked him how long. He said, months, maybe 6. Can you do that? I told him I could. The next thing I did was install a small camera. Not in the bedroom, I want to be clear. I never wanted to see anything like that. I put it in the den, where my desk is, where the household papers live. It was disguised as a USB charging block in the wall outlet. $200 on the internet. It recorded audio and video and uploaded it to a cloud account that Maggie didn't know existed. In the den is where I learned almost everything. The man's name was Kenneth. He was 56, 12 years younger than me, and he sold commercial real estate in Glastonbury. They had been having an affair for 11 years. 11. I sat in my truck in a Home Depot parking lot the night I figured that timeline out, and I cried. I'm not ashamed to tell you that. I cried like a child for about 20 minutes, then I wiped my face, drove home, and ate dinner with my wife, and complimented her pot roast. But that wasn't the worst of what I learned in the den. In late November, Maggie was in there one afternoon when she thought I was at the gym. She was on the phone with our son, with Jason. She said, "Honey, listen, he's going to ask you to come home for Thanksgiving. I need you to act normal. Ken and I are getting close to having everything in place." There was a pause, and then Jason said, and I'm telling you exactly what he said because the words are burned into my brain, "Mom, he's not even my real dad. I don't owe him a Thanksgiving." I had to turn off the recording. I sat on the floor of my den, 68 years old, with my back against the bookshelf, and I tried to breathe. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The boy I had stayed up with all night when he had croup at age 4. The boy whose tuition I had paid at Carnegie Mellon. Not mine. I went and listened to it again. I needed to be sure. He said it again. Not even my real dad. Howard Beasley took the call from me that night at his home. I told him what I'd heard. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I want you to do a paternity test. Quietly. Use the hairbrush. We'll get it done at a private lab in Boston. Don't tell a soul." It took 10 days. The results came in an envelope to a P.O. box I'd opened in West Hartford under my own name, but at an address Maggie didn't know. I opened it standing at the post office counter. The clerk asked if I was all right. I said I was fine. I drove to a park, sat on a bench, and read it twice. Jason was not my biological son. I did the math in my head. Jason was conceived in the spring of 1987. I would have been 30. Maggie would have been 41. I tried to remember what was happening in our marriage that spring. I couldn't. It had been a normal year. I had been working long hours on a bridge project in New Haven. Long hours. The math closed up around me like a fist. I went home that night, and I made spaghetti for my wife, and I asked her about her day, and she told me about the Christmas decorations she wanted to order from Pottery Barn. I said they sounded lovely. December was the hardest month of my life. I was wearing 2 faces all day, every day. Inside the house, I was the same dull, retired engineer who watched Jeopardy and went to bed at 10. Outside the house, I was building a case. Howard Beasley and I met every Wednesday morning at a diner 40 miles away. He pulled bank records I didn't even know were available. He found accounts in Maggie's name at 3 different banks I'd never heard of. There was a money market account in Stamford with $280,000 in it. She had been transferring small amounts, $3,000 here, $5,000 there, out of our joint accounts for 9 years. The total she had skimmed was just over $400,000. There was more. Kenneth had a mortgage on a condo in Florida. Maggie was the co-signer. They had been planning to move there together once the situation was resolved. That was Howard's word, situation. He used it the way a surgeon uses the word mass. In early January, Howard told me Maggie had hired a divorce attorney in Hartford, a woman named Rebecca Fontaine, known around the local bar as a shark. The strategy, Howard told me, was clearly going to be to portray me as a man in cognitive decline. Maggie had been quietly telling her sister and a few friends that I'd been forgetting things and acting strangely. She had even, Howard found out, taken me to a different doctor than usual the previous summer for a routine physical and asked the doctor outside my hearing, in the hallway, about cognitive screening. She was building a paper trail. I went home that night and I started forgetting things on purpose. Small things. I left the milk out. I asked her twice in one evening when our daughter was coming for Easter. I called Jason Jimmy once at the dinner table and then corrected myself with a confused look. I watched her eyes light up each time. She was filing every moment away for later use. You have to understand something. I didn't enjoy this. I was grieving. I was grieving my whole life. But I also knew that the only weapon I had was the certainty that I was weak. In late January, Maggie filed for divorce. She came to me in the living room with her attorney's letter and tears in her eyes and said she was sorry. She was just so sorry, but she couldn't pretend anymore. She said we'd grown apart. She said she'd already moved out emotionally years ago. She said she would always love me as the father of her children and the man who had given her a beautiful life. The father of her children. She actually said that. I almost couldn't keep my face still. I told her I understood. I told her I didn't want to fight her. I asked if I could have a few days to find a lawyer. She said of course. She said we should be civil. She said she had already thought about everything and had a fair proposal. She would take the house, the cabin in the Berkshires, half of my pension, and the joint savings. I would keep my truck and the IRA in my own name, and she'd let me stay in the guest cottage behind the house as long as I needed. I told her that sounded reasonable. I told her I'd think about it. That night, she went out to dinner with her sister. The minute she pulled out of the driveway, I called Howard. I told him she'd filed. He said, "Now we move." On the day of the hearing, I dressed in a charcoal suit I'd had tailored 2 weeks before. I had my white haircut and my beard neatly trimmed. I shined my own shoes. I drove myself to the courthouse in downtown Hartford, parked, and walked in by myself. Howard met me on the courthouse steps. He had a leather portfolio under his arm. When Maggie saw me in the hallway, something flickered in her face. Just for a second. Something like worry. She had expected me in the rumpled cardigan and the jeans I'd been wearing all winter. Kenneth was standing next to her. He was a tall, tan man with capped teeth, the kind of man who buys shoes on a website and tells himself he has style. Jason was there too. Jason had flown in from Seattle for this. He stood on the other side of his mother in a dark suit, his arms folded. He didn't look at me. Maggie leaned over to Kenneth and whispered something. Kenneth laughed, loud in the hallway, in a courthouse. He laughed at me. Maggie smiled and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "He won't even know what hit him." I walked past them and I sat down on the bench outside the courtroom. Howard sat next to me. He patted my knee one time and said, "You ready?" I said I was. We went in. Judge Patricia Whitman was on the bench. Maggie's attorney, the shark Rebecca Fontaine, opened first. She painted a picture of a man who had become difficult to live with. A man whose memory was failing. A man who, by his wife's own observation, had been confused at family dinners, had been forgetting names of grandchildren, had been leaving the stove on. She submitted a folder of documented incidents that Maggie had been keeping. She presented Maggie's request for the marital home, the cabin, half the pension, and the bulk of the savings as a generous and protective arrangement designed to ensure that I would be cared for. Maggie sat at her table with her head tilted to the side, dabbing one eye with a tissue. Kenneth sat in the gallery behind her. Jason sat next to Kenneth. They had the body language of a family. I noted that. Judge Whitman turned to Howard. "Counsel for the respondent." Howard stood up. He did not raise his voice. He never raises his voice. He said, "Your Honor, before I respond to the petitioner's filing, my client has asked me to present a sealed letter to the court for your review prior to any further argument. We have provided the copy to opposing counsel this morning." Rebecca Fontaine opened her copy. I watched her face. I watched it carefully. She read about 3 lines and then her shoulders dropped about an inch. The judge opened her envelope. She read. She read for about a minute and a half. Then, she did something I will remember for the rest of my life. She took off her reading glasses, set them on the bench, and laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real laugh. The kind that comes out of a person when they've been doing a hard job for a long time and someone has finally handed them something interesting. She looked over at Maggie's table. She said, "Counsel, your client may want to consult with you before we proceed." Then she said the words I had been waiting 6 months to hear. She said, "We'll take a 15-minute recess. When we come back, I'd like to discuss what counsel for the respondent has put before this court." In that 15 minutes in a small conference room down the hall, Howard laid it all out for Rebecca Fontaine. 11 years of audio recordings between Maggie and Kenneth. Bank records showing $408,000 systematically transferred out of marital funds into Maggie's separate accounts over 9 years, in amounts deliberately structured to stay below federal reporting thresholds. The Florida condo. The mortgage. The paternity test on Jason. A signed affidavit from a forensic accountant in Boston, a signed affidavit from a neurologist at Yale who had examined me 3 weeks earlier and confirmed I was in full possession of my faculties. Howard had also, with my permission, contacted the Connecticut State Police White-Collar Crimes Division, who had quietly opened a file 2 months earlier. Rebecca Fontaine listened. When Howard was finished, she asked for a moment alone with her client. When we went back into the courtroom, Maggie's face had gone the color of paper. Kenneth had left the gallery. He had simply walked out of the courthouse during the recess, which I later learned is not a great thing to do when state police investigators know you exist. Rebecca Fontaine stood up. She said, "Your Honor, my client would like to withdraw her petition at this time and request that the matter be continued." Judge Whitman looked at her over her glasses. She said, "Counsel, that's not how this works. Your client filed in this court. The respondent has filed a counterclaim and presented evidence. We'll proceed." What happened in the next 2 hours, I'll spare you most of. Howard played selected audio for the court. He played the November phone call between Maggie and Jason. I watched Jason in the gallery when his own voice came through the speakers, saying I wasn't his real dad. He went so pale I thought he might pass out. He looked at me for the first time all day. I held his eyes and I didn't look away. The judge ordered an immediate freeze on all of Maggie's separate accounts pending a fraud investigation. She denied her petition for division of marital assets and instead, on Howard's counterclaim, ordered Maggie to repay the $408,000 to the marital estate, plus interest, plus my legal fees. The cabin in the Berkshires remained mine. The house, which had been bought entirely with funds I'd brought into the marriage, was awarded to me. Maggie was given 30 days to vacate. A week later, the state filed criminal charges. Maggie was indicted on 12 counts of wire fraud and structuring. Kenneth was indicted on 7 counts, including conspiracy. The Florida condo was seized as proceeds of the fraud. Maggie eventually pled out and got 4 years in a federal facility in Danbury plus restitution. Kenneth, who had a prior conviction nobody knew about, got 6. Jason was not charged with anything. He had benefited from the scheme. Maggie had paid for parts of his Carnegie Mellon tuition out of the skimmed funds, but he hadn't been a knowing participant. The investigators looked at him hard and let him go. He came to see me about 3 weeks after the hearing. He drove out from Seattle. He sat in my kitchen and he didn't know where to start. I made him a cup of coffee. He cried. He said he had only learned the truth about his paternity when he was 22, and his mother had told him then that I was a man who had never really wanted him, who had only stayed out of duty, and that she had protected him from me his entire life. He said he had believed her. He said he was sorry. I want to tell you I forgave him on the spot. I didn't. I told him I needed time. I told him that the boy I had raised, who I had loved with everything I had for 37 years, that boy was real to me whether or not we shared blood, and that what hurt most wasn't the biology. It was that he had stood next to her in that hallway and laughed. He cried harder. I let him cry. We're slowly rebuilding something. He flies out once a month now. He helps me on the cabin in the summer. I don't know where it goes. I'm not in a rush. My daughter Chloe was destroyed by all of this. She had known nothing. She is biologically mine, a fact we confirmed quietly. She's still her mother's daughter, and she is trying, in her own way, to hold a relationship with both of us, and I let her. Life is too short to make a child choose. I sold the West Hartford house in the spring. I couldn't sleep there anymore. I bought a smaller place on a lake in New Hampshire, a one-story cottage with a long view of the water, and I did most of the renovation work myself. I cook for one now. I'm getting better at it. A friend asked me a couple months ago whether I felt like I had won. I thought about it for a long time before I answered him. I told him no, I didn't feel like I'd won. Winning would have been 43 years of the marriage I thought I had. What I had instead was the truth, and a kind of peace, and a quiet life on a lake. I told him that for a man my age, that's enough. More than enough. What I learned, if there's a lesson in any of this, is that gentleness is not weakness. They mistook one for the other, and that was the only mistake they really needed to make. The morning I drove away from the courthouse, I rolled the window down even though it was cold. I let the air hit my face. I thought about my father, who had been a quiet man too, and who used to tell me when I was a boy that the loudest people in any room are usually the most afraid. I hadn't understood it then. I do now. I'm 68 years old. I'm starting over. And anyone who tells you it's too late for that has never sat in a courtroom and watched a judge open an envelope. I sit on the porch of this lake house most evenings now, watching the sun drop behind the pines, and I think about cause and effect. Engineers like me, we live by it. Every load has a source. Every crack in a foundation comes from somewhere. Nothing happens because the universe is cruel. Things happen because choices were made, sometimes years before anyone notices the damage. Maggie didn't end up in a federal facility in Danbury because the world turned on her. She ended up there because 11 years earlier, she made a choice in a kitchen with a man named Kenneth. And then she made that choice again and again, every single morning for over a decade. Kenneth didn't lose his condo and his freedom because of bad luck. He lost them because he sat in my house, drank my coffee, and convinced himself that a quiet, older man wouldn't be paying attention. And Jason, my Jason, didn't stand in that hallway laughing because he was a bad son. He stood there because for years his mother had fed him a story, and he had chosen every time not to question it. Small choices. Small lies told to himself. They compound the way interest does until one day the bill comes due in a courtroom. What I want to leave you with isn't anger. I'm too tired for anger now. What I want to leave you with is this. The 3 things that saved me at 68 years old were the 3 things I'd been quietly building my whole life without knowing it. The first was character. I didn't lash out the night I heard Kenneth's voice in my kitchen. I didn't punch a wall. I didn't pour gasoline on her car. I held myself steady because I had spent 40 years being a man who held himself steady, and that habit was the only thing standing between me and a much worse outcome. The second was intelligence, not cleverness, not cunning, just the patient, ordinary kind of intelligence that knows how to gather facts before drawing conclusions. I was an engineer. I trusted the data. I let Howard Beasley do his work. I didn't act on emotion when emotion would have ruined me. And the third was endurance. 6 months of sleeping next to a woman who was stealing from me. 6 months of pretending to forget my grandchildren's names. 6 months of eating a pot roast and complimenting her Christmas decorations while a federal investigation quietly tightened around her. That kind of endurance isn't something you find in yourself overnight. You build it across a lifetime, in small moments nobody applauds, by showing up to a job for 41 years and balancing a checkbook on Sunday nights. If you take anything from what happened to me, take this. Be the kind of person they underestimate. Stay calm. Tell the truth to yourself before you tell it to anyone else. Do the slow, boring, honest work of becoming someone who can weather a hard season. Because hard seasons come for everyone eventually. And when yours comes, what's already inside you is the only thing that's going to be there. I'm starting over now. The lake is quiet. The mornings are mine.